Julian sat in his dimly lit apartment, the glow from the TV casting faint shadows on the walls. The small space was cluttered with unopened bills and pill bottles, a reflection of his life, quiet and overwhelmed. At 28, he worked as a caregiver for the elderly, spending long days tending to others while his own existence felt hollow. Raised in an orphanage, Julian had never known the warmth of family, and now, facing a chronic illness, loneliness clung to him like a shadow. He yearned for more, but the hope of finding his real family had faded long ago. One evening, during a break at the hospital, a fellow nurse's words hit him harder than expected. "Family isn't just about blood," she'd said, casually sipping her coffee. The thought stuck with Julian as he walked home, those simple words stirring something inside him. Sitting in his small apartment later that night, he wondered if maybe, just maybe, he'd been looking for belonging in the wrong places. As he lay down, he found himself holding on to a flicker of hope, unsure but quietly desperate for change. The next morning, Julian's routine remained the same, but something felt different. His conversation from the previous night echoed in his mind as he walked the familiar path to the hospital. It wasn't that his life had suddenly changed, his small apartment and the weight of his illness still loomed, but there was a shift, however slight, in the way he viewed his world. Julian had always felt adrift, but now, he found himself looking for signs that he might not be as alone as he believed. Perhaps there was something, or someone, waiting for him, just out of reach. Later that day, as Julian was about to finish his shift, an unexpected call came through. The voice on the other end was sharp and businesslike, introducing himself as Edward Johnson. Edward needed someone immediately to care for his ailing wife, Emma, an older woman who was critically ill. "It's a demanding job," Edward warned, his tone almost cold, "but it pays well." Julian hesitated, something in the man's voice unsettled him, but the offer was too good to ignore. After agreeing to meet the next day, Julian couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just another job, it was the beginning of something far bigger than he realized. The following day, Julian found himself standing before the grand, imposing gates of the Johnson estate. It was a stark contrast to the modest homes of his usual clients, and he couldn't help but feel out of place. As the gates creaked open, Julian was greeted by the sight of a sprawling mansion, its pristine lawns and towering walls exuding wealth and power. A butler escorted him inside, and the atmosphere only grew more intimidating. Everything was polished, cold, and almost too perfect, much like the man who awaited him in the study. Edward Johnson was tall, impeccably dressed, and carried an air of control that bordered on unsettling. He barely acknowledged Julian as he entered the room, his eyes focused on a set of documents on his desk. "You'll be caring for my wife, Emma," Edward said without looking up. "She's been unwell for some time, and I need someone dependable." His voice was flat, devoid of any warmth or concern, and Julian immediately felt a tension in the air. It wasn't just a job, there was something deeper going on here. As Julian listened, he couldn't help but notice how Edward spoke of Emma as though she were a burden, rather than someone he loved. There was no mention of her condition beyond vague details, no emotion behind his words. The coldness of it all struck Julian, but he kept his thoughts to himself. He needed the work, and despite his reservations, this was an opportunity he couldn't afford to pass up. "I'll do my best to help her," Julian said simply, hoping to sound professional. After their brief, uncomfortable meeting, Edward led Julian to Emma's room. The heavy wooden door creaked as it opened, revealing a dimly lit space where Emma lay in a large bed. She was frail, her skin pale against the white sheets, but there was a softness in her eyes that immediately drew Julian in. Despite her condition, she smiled weakly at him, a gesture that felt far warmer than anything Edward had offered. "You must be Julian," she said softly, her voice weak but kind. "Thank you for coming." Julian felt an unexpected wave of emotion, sensing a kindness in Emma that stood in stark contrast to her cold surroundings. As Julian settled into his role, tending to Emma's needs, he found himself growing more comfortable in her presence. There was something about her, an unspoken connection that made him want to protect her, to do more than just his job. It was a strange, almost instinctive pull, one that he couldn't quite explain. Still, the tension in the house remained, and every encounter with Edward left Julian feeling uneasy. He couldn't shake the sense that there was more to this family's story than what met the eye. As the days passed, Julian found himself drawn deeper into Emma's world. She was not just a patient to him, there was a warmth in her presence that made him feel seen, in a way no one had before. Despite her illness, Emma was sharp, often sharing stories from her past that captivated Julian. He would sit by her bedside, listening intently, as she spoke about her youth, the places she'd traveled, and the life she had led before her health declined. Julian, in turn, found himself opening up to her, sharing small details about his own life, though he avoided speaking of the loneliness that haunted him. One afternoon, while Julian was adjusting Emma's pillows, she turned to him with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Julian," she began softly, "family isn't always who you're born to. Sometimes, it's the people who come into your life when you least expect it." Her words echoed the conversation he'd had with his colleague at the hospital, and it hit him deeply. Julian smiled, unsure how to respond, but something stirred within him, a feeling that Emma understood him in ways no one else ever had. Emma's kindness toward Julian only deepened his growing attachment to her. She treated him not just as a caregiver but almost as family, often calling him "my dear" and speaking to him with a warmth that made him feel as though he belonged. But with every moment of closeness between them, Julian felt the tension with Edward increase. Edward would watch their interactions from a distance, his eyes cold and calculating, as if he resented the bond forming between them. Julian sensed that Edward didn't care for his wife as a husband should, and the thought troubled him more each day. One evening, after an unusually tense exchange with Edward, Julian sat in his apartment, his mind racing. Why did he feel such a connection to Emma? It wasn't logical, he barely knew her, yet he felt like he had known her his whole life. Emma had mentioned once that she'd lost someone long ago, but she never went into detail. Julian couldn't help but wonder if there was more to her story, something that Edward was keeping from him. His instincts told him to be cautious, but his heart was telling him something else entirely, that he needed to protect her, no matter the cost. The more time Julian spent in the Johnson household, the more conflicted he became. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was becoming too emotionally involved, that he was crossing a line. His professional training told him to keep a distance, but with Emma, it felt impossible. She wasn't just a patient anymore, she was someone who mattered to him in a way that no one else ever had. And with each passing day, that feeling only grew stronger, even as the shadow of Edward loomed larger over them both. Weeks passed, and the connection between Julian and Emma only deepened. She trusted him in a way that felt almost familial, and Julian found himself looking forward to their conversations more than anything else in his day. But one morning, as Julian was helping Emma with her medication, she reached out and took his hand, her grip surprisingly firm. "Julian," she said softly, her eyes filled with a strange, pleading intensity. "I need to ask you something unusual." Julian, caught off guard, nodded cautiously, unsure of what was coming next. "I want you to pretend to be my son. Just for one day." Julian froze, his mind racing. "Your son?" he asked, his voice laced with confusion. "But why?" Emma's eyes softened, and a deep sadness seemed to wash over her. "I lost my son a long time ago," she explained, her voice trembling with emotion. "I don't expect you to understand, but I need to feel like I have him back, even if it's only for a day." Julian hesitated, unsure of how to respond. It wasn't a typical request, and part of him worried about crossing boundaries. Yet, something in her plea touched him deeply, as if this was about more than just a simple favor. The weight of the moment hung in the air between them. Julian could see the desperation in Emma's eyes, and he felt torn. He had always prided himself on maintaining professionalism with his patients, but this was different. Emma had come to mean more to him than just a job. After what felt like an eternity, Julian nodded. "Okay," he said softly, "I'll do it." Emma's face lit up with relief, and for the first time in weeks, she smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that warmed Julian in ways he hadn't expected. He wasn't sure what the day ahead would bring, but he knew it was something Emma needed. That day, Julian became her son. They spent hours together, walking in the garden and reminiscing as if they had shared a lifetime of memories. Emma seemed lighter, happier, and Julian couldn't help but feel an odd sense of belonging in the role. For the first time in a long while, he felt connected to something, or someone, in a way that went beyond obligation. It was as though, in this brief moment of pretending, he had found a piece of the family he had longed for all his life. But even as he played the part, a question lingered in the back of his mind: why did he feel this way about a woman he barely knew? That evening, as they sat together watching the sun set over the estate, Emma turned to him. "Thank you, Julian," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "You've given me something I thought I'd lost forever." Julian smiled, but before he could respond, a shadow loomed over them. Edward stood at the doorway, his expression unreadable, but his presence sent a chill through the air. The warmth of the day vanished, replaced by an unsettling tension. "It's late," Edward said coldly. "Julian, I think it's time for you to leave." Julian nodded, feeling the weight of Edward's gaze on him, but as he walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning of something much darker. As Julian continued his work at the Johnson estate, the atmosphere between him and Edward grew increasingly tense. It was subtle at first, Edward watching from the corner of the room, a coldness in his gaze that made Julian uncomfortable. But as the days passed, the tension became undeniable. Every interaction with Edward left Julian on edge, as if they were engaged in an unspoken battle. Edward's behavior was always distant, but now there was a hint of something more, something almost threatening. Julian could feel it in the way Edward spoke to him, in the calculated way he moved around the house. One evening, after Julian had helped Emma to bed, Edward approached him in the hallway. "You seem to be getting quite close to my wife," Edward said, his tone calm but his words laced with an accusation. Julian stiffened, unsure of how to respond. "I'm just doing my job," he replied cautiously, but Edward's smirk told him the man didn't believe that for a second. "Remember," Edward continued, "you're here to care for her, not to become part of the family." The words stung more than Julian expected, and he found himself questioning why Edward seemed so intent on keeping him at a distance. At the same time, Julian couldn't ignore the growing suspicions he had about Edward. Something about the way Edward treated Emma didn't sit right with him. While Emma's condition seemed to fluctuate, Julian noticed small, troubling inconsistencies, medications that didn't seem to match her symptoms, or doses that felt excessive. He couldn't put his finger on it, but the more time he spent in the house, the more he felt that Edward wasn't being entirely truthful about his wife's care. A dark thought began to creep into Julian's mind: could Edward be deliberately worsening Emma's condition? Despite his suspicions, Julian knew he had to tread carefully. He didn't have any proof, and confronting Edward directly could risk everything. But the closer he became to Emma, the more he felt a responsibility to protect her. She had become more than just a patient to him, she was someone he cared for deeply, and the thought of Edward doing anything to harm her filled him with quiet rage. Still, he knew he couldn't act on his emotions without evidence. He would have to keep his eyes open, watching for any signs that his fears were justified. As the tension between him and Edward escalated, Julian's bond with Emma only grew stronger. She trusted him completely, and that trust made him even more determined to figure out what was really going on in the house. Every day, as he cared for her, Julian found himself drawn deeper into her world, and the more he learned, the more he realized that there were secrets within the Johnson family that ran far deeper than he had first imagined. And whatever those secrets were, Julian knew one thing for certain: they would change everything. With Julian now taking on the role of Emma's son, life inside the mansion took on a strange new rhythm. They spent more time together than ever before, walking through the gardens, sharing meals, and talking about everything from childhood memories to the future. Julian found comfort in these moments, even though part of him knew it was all an act. Yet, the more they played this game of pretend, the more it felt real to him. Emma's presence brought a warmth to his life that he hadn't felt in years, and Julian couldn't help but think, for just a moment, that maybe he had found something like a family here. During one of their walks, Julian began to notice small details about the house that didn't quite add up. The medications Emma took were always prepared by Edward's staff, and when Julian asked about them, the answers he received were vague. Emma's health seemed to fluctuate without explanation. Some days she was lucid and full of energy, and others, she could barely lift her head. It was unsettling. Julian couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong, and his suspicions about Edward's role in her condition grew stronger with each passing day. One afternoon, while helping Emma organize some old letters, Julian made a startling discovery. Hidden at the bottom of a drawer was a letter, dated many years ago, written in Emma's delicate handwriting. As he read the words, his heart began to race. The letter spoke of a son, Emma's son, who had been taken from her shortly after birth. Julian's mind swirled with possibilities. Could it be that Emma had lost her child in a way that mirrored his own story? Was there a chance that he was somehow connected to her, more than just through this strange job? It was a thought too wild to fully believe, yet he couldn't ignore the similarities. As Julian sat with this discovery, he found himself lost in thought. If what he suspected was true, then everything about his life, and his connection to Emma, would change. The pieces seemed to fit, but he needed proof. He needed to know more about Emma's past and what had really happened to her child. The thought of confronting Edward, of asking questions about something so deeply personal, filled him with anxiety, but Julian knew he couldn't just let it go. If there was even a chance that he and Emma were connected by more than just circumstance, he had to find out the truth. From that moment on, Julian couldn't look at Emma the same way. Every interaction with her felt charged with new meaning. The possibility that he was her long-lost son consumed him, even as he tried to focus on his work. The mansion, once merely a place of employment, had become a puzzle, and Julian was determined to solve it. But as the days passed, he began to sense that Edward knew something he wasn't willing to share. Julian's search for answers had begun, but he was also aware that the closer he got to the truth, the more dangerous things would become. As Julian grew closer to the truth, the atmosphere in the mansion shifted noticeably. Edward, who had always been distant, now became openly hostile. It started with small things, curt comments, icy glares, but soon escalated into more direct confrontations. "You're overstepping," Edward hissed one evening, his eyes burning with barely concealed anger. "You're here to do a job, nothing more. Don't get too comfortable." Julian, though unnerved, held his ground. He knew he had to be cautious, but the tension only fueled his suspicions about Edward's true intentions. Emma's condition worsened, seemingly overnight. One morning, Julian found her unusually weak, barely able to keep her eyes open. His heart raced as he checked her vitals, and the fear that had been gnawing at him became undeniable. Something wasn't right. Edward appeared soon after, his face expressionless as he stood in the doorway. "She's just having a bad day," he said, dismissively waving a hand. But Julian wasn't convinced. He had been tracking Emma's medication carefully, and something was off. The dosages didn't match her symptoms, and the more he thought about it, the more certain he became Edward was manipulating her treatment. That evening, Julian sat alone in his small apartment, the weight of his suspicions pressing down on him. He knew he had to act, but how? He had no concrete evidence, just a gut feeling and a few inconsistencies in Emma's care. Confronting Edward directly felt too dangerous. There was no telling what lengths the man would go to protect his secret. But as Julian thought back to the letter he had found, the realization hit him with full force: Edward knew about Emma's lost son. And if Julian was right, that meant Edward had a reason to keep Emma from finding out the truth. Days passed, and the tension in the house only grew thicker. Julian tried to maintain his distance, but it was impossible to ignore Edward's constant presence. Every time Julian entered Emma's room, he could feel Edward watching him, calculating. It became clear that Edward was aware of Julian's growing suspicions. One afternoon, as Julian prepared Emma's medication, Edward stepped into the room, his eyes cold and dark. "You're getting too close," Edward warned, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't let you ruin this." The words hung in the air like a threat, and Julian realized that whatever Edward was hiding, he was willing to go to great lengths to protect it. Julian knew he was in over his head, but he couldn't turn back now. Emma's life was at stake, and the possibility that she was his mother only added to his sense of urgency. He began documenting everything: medications, changes in Emma's condition, and every interaction with Edward. He knew it wasn't much, but it was a start. The mansion, once a place of quiet care, now felt like a battleground, and Julian had to be ready for whatever was coming. The question wasn't if Edward would make his move, it was when. Emma's condition took a sharp turn for the worse. One morning, Julian found her barely conscious, her breathing shallow, and her pulse weak. Panic set in as he rushed to check her medications, confirming what he had feared: the dosages had been tampered with. His heart raced, but before he could take any further action, Edward appeared in the doorway. "What are you doing?" Edward snapped, his voice cold and menacing. Julian felt his chest tighten. "She's not well, Edward," Julian said, his voice trembling. "I need to call for help." But Edward blocked his path, his eyes hard. "You've done enough." The confrontation escalated quickly. Julian tried to reason with Edward, but it became clear that the man had no intention of letting him intervene. "This is all part of the process," Edward insisted, his voice eerily calm. "Emma's time is coming. There's nothing you can do." Julian's blood boiled with rage and helplessness. He had known that Edward was dangerous, but seeing him so indifferent to Emma's suffering made Julian feel sick. Still, without proof, there was nothing he could do. Edward had complete control of the situation, and Julian was powerless to stop him. Forced to leave the room, Julian found himself pacing the hallway, his mind racing. He couldn't just stand by and watch Emma die, but without evidence, any move he made could backfire. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, and for the first time since coming to the mansion, Julian felt truly defeated. Every instinct told him to run, to get out before things got worse, but his heart wouldn't let him leave Emma behind. She had become more than a patient to him, she was his only connection to the possibility of family, to the life he had always longed for. Edward's final blow came later that evening. "You're done here, Julian," he said flatly, standing in the doorway to Emma's room. "Pack your things and leave." The words hit Julian like a punch to the gut. He had failed. He had promised himself he would protect Emma, and now she was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do. Edward, with his icy composure, had won. Julian left the mansion that night feeling utterly defeated, the weight of his guilt and powerlessness suffocating him. Everything felt lost. As Julian walked away from the estate, the darkness of the night mirrored the despair in his heart. He had tried to help, but in the end, he had been no match for Edward's manipulation and control. Now, with Emma's life hanging by a thread, Julian felt as though he had lost not only his chance to save her but also his only hope of finding the family he had always dreamed of. Alone and broken, Julian knew he couldn't go back, but he also couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't finished. The story wasn't over yet. Julian sat in his small apartment, staring at the piles of unopened bills and scattered remnants of his life. The weight of failure sat heavy on his chest, making it hard to breathe. He had left the Johnson estate, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he had abandoned Emma in her time of need. His mind raced with thoughts of what he could have done differently, but it all circled back to the same painful truth: he had no proof, and without it, Edward held all the power. The silence of the apartment was deafening, the loneliness suffocating, as Julian grappled with the realization that he might never see Emma again. As the hours dragged on, Julian found himself reflecting on everything Emma had told him. Her stories, her kindness, and the strange, undeniable connection they had shared. The words of his colleague echoed in his mind: family isn't just about blood. But for Julian, that idea had taken on a much deeper meaning. Emma had felt like family to him in a way no one else ever had, and now, the possibility that she truly was his mother weighed heavily on him. If she was his mother, and Edward was trying to kill her, Julian knew he couldn't live with himself if he didn't try to stop it. But how? He had no resources, no allies, and barely any information. Yet, as Julian replayed every moment he had spent with Emma, a new thought occurred to him. Emma's health had deteriorated rapidly, but there had been moments, brief, fleeting moments, where she had seemed almost lucid, as though she were trying to tell him something. What if there was something she wanted him to know, something she couldn't say outright? Julian's heart raced as he considered the possibility that there might still be a way to save her. But first, he needed to find out exactly what Edward had been hiding. Determined not to give up, Julian began to piece together everything he had learned during his time at the mansion. He recalled Emma's medications, the strange changes in her condition, and the letter he had found. There were too many inconsistencies, too many unanswered questions. The puzzle was still incomplete, but Julian felt as though he was getting closer to understanding the full picture. He had to act quickly, but he also had to be smart. One wrong move, and Edward would bury the truth forever. Julian couldn't afford to let that happen. With renewed determination, Julian made a decision. He couldn't sit back and let Emma die, not without a fight. He might not have all the answers yet, but he knew one thing for certain: Edward was hiding something, and whatever it was the key to saving Emma. Julian had spent his whole life feeling powerless, but now, for the first time, he had a purpose. He wasn't just fighting for Emma, he was fighting for himself, for the family he had always dreamed of finding. And he wasn't going to stop until he uncovered the truth. Before heading to the mansion, Julian made a stop at the hospital where he worked. He sought out Dr. Bennett, one of the physicians he trusted most. "I need your help," Julian said urgently, explaining the situation as best as he could without revealing too much. Dr. Bennett listened carefully, his brow furrowed with concern. "If what you're saying is true, Julian, we need to act fast," the doctor said. "But we'll need solid evidence to make any kind of case." Julian nodded, knowing he was putting a lot on the line, but it was the only way forward. Dr. Bennett agreed to review the medication records and offered his support, giving Julian the confidence he needed to confront Edward. That evening, Julian arrived at the mansion with a newfound resolve. He knew Edward wouldn't expect him to return, especially not so soon. As he entered the grand, cold halls of the estate, a sense of unease crept over him, but he pushed it aside. His mind was focused on one thing: saving Emma. He moved quickly through the house, heading straight for Emma's room, but before he could reach her, Edward appeared, blocking his path. "What are you doing here?" Edward asked, his voice sharp and filled with suspicion. Julian stood his ground, refusing to be intimidated. "I'm here to see Emma," he replied, his voice steady. "And I'm not leaving until I do." Edward's face twisted into a sneer, but there was something else in his expression, a flicker of fear. He knew Julian was on to him. "You're meddling in things you don't understand," Edward spat, stepping closer. "This isn't your fight." Julian felt his heart race, but he kept his composure. "You're wrong," Julian said quietly. "This is exactly my fight." For the first time, Julian felt like he had the upper hand. Edward's calm, collected mask was slipping, and Julian could see the cracks forming. He wasn't just a caregiver anymore, he was someone with a mission, and Edward knew it. With Dr. Bennett's support and the evidence he had gathered, Julian was ready to make his move. "I know what you've been doing to Emma," Julian said, his voice firm. "And I'm going to prove it." Edward's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Julian stepped past him, heading straight for Emma's room. The confrontation had begun, and Julian knew there was no turning back. The truth was finally within reach, but what he would find once he confronted Edward fully was still uncertain. All that mattered now was saving Emma, and uncovering the secrets that had been buried for far too long. Julian entered Emma's room, his heart pounding in his chest. She lay there, pale and fragile, but her eyes flickered open when she sensed his presence. "Julian," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Julian knelt by her bedside, taking her hand in his. "I'm here, Emma. I'm going to help you." Before he could say more, Edward stormed into the room, his face twisted with rage. "You need to leave," Edward snapped, stepping toward Julian. But Julian didn't flinch. "No, Edward," Julian said firmly. "It's over. I know what you've been doing." Julian pulled out the evidence he had gathered, the notes, the medication records, and a letter from Dr. Bennett confirming the discrepancies in Emma's treatment. Edward's face paled as he saw the documents. This doesn't prove anything," Edward stammered, but his voice wavered. Julian could see the fear growing in his eyes. "It proves enough," Julian countered, his voice steady. "I've already contacted the authorities, and they'll be here soon." "It's over, Edward." For the first time, Edward seemed truly cornered. The calm, calculating man was gone, replaced by a desperate figure trying to cling to the last of his control. As Edward's world crumbled around him, Julian took a deep breath. "I also know about Emma's son," he said quietly, watching as Edward's expression shifted from fear to fury. "You kept her in the dark, poisoned her, all to keep her from finding out the truth." Edward lunged toward Julian in a fit of rage, but before he could reach him, the door burst open. Members of Emma's legal team, along with Dr. Bennett, entered the room. "It's over, Edward," one of the lawyers said calmly. "You're under arrest." Edward's face twisted with defeat as the police arrived to take him away, his final desperate attempts to cover the truth futile. With Edward finally gone, Julian turned back to Emma, his heart heavy with emotion. "Emma," he began softly, "there's something I need to tell you." She looked at him, her eyes filled with a quiet understanding. "I know," she whispered. "You're my son, aren't you?" Julian felt a wave of emotion crash over him, tears welling in his eyes. "I think I am," he said, his voice trembling. Emma smiled, a peaceful, knowing smile, as if she had known all along. "I always knew in my heart," she whispered, her grip on his hand tightening for just a moment. "I'm so glad you found me." Emma passed away peacefully that evening, her hand still in Julian's. She had lived her final moments with the knowledge that her son had come back to her, and Julian felt a sense of peace he had never known before. Though he had lost her, he had gained something far more profound, the truth about who he was, and the family he had always longed for. The battle with Edward was over, and as Julian sat by Emma's side, he knew that, in the end, love had won. In the weeks following Emma's passing, the estate was transformed. The legal proceedings moved swiftly, and with Edward's arrest, Julian was named as the rightful heir to Emma's fortune. But the money meant little to Julian. What mattered was the connection he had found, the family he had longed for, and the sense of belonging that had eluded him his whole life. Instead of keeping the wealth for himself, Julian decided to honor Emma's memory in the most meaningful way he could think of, by using it to help others, just as she had helped him find his way. With the inheritance, Julian established the Emma Foundation, a charitable organization dedicated to providing care for orphans and those suffering from illness, just like he had once been. The foundation's mission was simple: to give hope to those who, like him, had felt lost and alone. Julian poured his heart and soul into the project, ensuring that Emma's legacy would live on through the kindness and compassion she had shown him. The foundation became a place of healing, not just for the people it served, but for Julian himself. As the months passed, the mansion was transformed into the headquarters of the foundation, a place where children and families could find support and care. The cold, sterile halls that had once echoed with tension now buzzed with life and laughter. Julian walked through the rooms, remembering the difficult moments he had faced there, but feeling a sense of closure. The mansion, once a symbol of loneliness and deceit, had become a beacon of hope for so many. Emma's presence seemed to linger in every corner, guiding Julian as he continued the work they had started together. Through it all, Julian never forgot the journey that had brought him to this point. He reflected often on the lessons he had learned, that family is not always bound by blood, that love can be found in the most unexpected places, and that sometimes, the most important answers are the ones we carry within ourselves. His life had changed in ways he never could have imagined, but with that change came a deeper understanding of who he was, and the purpose he had found through the family he had made. In the end, Julian realized that while he had lost Emma, he had gained so much more. He had found his place in the world, surrounded by people who loved and cared for him, not because of his inheritance or his connection to Emma, but because of who he had become. The mansion, the foundation, and the people he helped were all reminders of the journey he had taken, and as Julian looked out over the estate, he knew that he had finally found the family he had always been searching for. Julian stood in the garden of the mansion, now transformed into a sanctuary for children who, like him, had grown up without a family. The same garden where he and Emma had walked together so many times now bustled with the laughter of kids playing, their carefree joy filling the air. As he walked down the familiar path, Julian felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The sun filtered through the trees, casting a warm glow over everything, and in that moment, he knew he had found his place in the world, a place where he belonged, surrounded by the family he had created. He paused by the bench where he and Emma had shared so many conversations, his heart filled with gratitude for the woman who had changed his life. Though she was gone, her presence was still felt in every part of this home, in every life that was touched by the foundation. Julian smiled as he watched the children run past, knowing that Emma's legacy would live on through the love and care they would receive. He had come full circle, no longer the lost, lonely man he once was, but someone with a purpose, a future, and a family. In that garden, Julian knew he had finally found peace.